So thank you very much for having me here today. My name's Sam. I work at a company called Teckle, and we're revolutionising the wealth management space using our technology. If you're interested, check out our website. You can talk to me more afterwards if you like. And yeah, I'm here today to talk about my experiences developing mobile applications with React Native and also native iOS applications with Swift. Right, so just a quick show of hands to begin with. Who here has worked with React Native before? Okay. Who's worked with Swift for developing native iOS? And who's done React? So a bit more with React. Okay, good. Fantastic. So I'll explain different things as I go along if you haven't used these technologies, but yeah, it's good to get a feel for the room. A bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about, a bit about how React Native works, just as a bit of a refresher to give some context if you haven't worked with it before, and then I'm going to kind of share my experiences. Stepping back briefly, this talk was really born out of a research project I did at my previous employer a few months ago. And we were thinking about launching a mobile application, and basically we weren't quite sure exactly what solution to go with. So I undertook a research project to see what the differences are between React Native and Swift, and using Swift for developing native applications. And the focus of this talk really is on what's the developer experience like, what it's like for me as a developer or you or anyone else to actually sit down and build these applications. What does it feel like? What's good about the different approaches and what could be improved? And I've also, it'll be obvious a bit more if you've worked with React before, but I'll explain it a bit later on. I've also got some comparisons between what it's like to work with React across the different areas as well. So comparing native iOS and React Native and React to see what it's like. So a quick overview on React Native for those of you that are maybe not as familiar with it. So React is a JavaScript library for building UIs, very famous, been promoted by Facebook, who created it. And React Native is also a JavaScript library, but for building cross-platform mobile applications. So the idea behind React Native is that you write one React Native and JavaScript application in one place, and it can be used across multiple platforms, whether that's iOS, Android, or even on an Amazon platform, for example. It's meant to be kind of platform independent. The important things to kind of take away about React Native is how it works. So it works in the same way to React for creating your user interface. So with React, you kind of split up your user interface into different components. So you might have a button component, a sidebar component, a footer bar component, and you kind of think of, your application is kind of encapsulated these different areas. Very similarly with React Native, you think of your mobile application as composed of these kind of encapsulated components. So you have a button component, and that button component handles all the functionality of clicking on a button, as well as all the UI bits you see as well and all the styling. So it's almost the same code for creating a React application as to creating a React Native application. Most React developers, as I was, coming into a React Native application, it's not too much of a learning curve going into it. The other important thing to take away about React Native is that you get a real native application. So I've got this Pinocchio thing down the bottom. I had the GIF version, but it was painful enough when I was practicing this presentation, so I thought I'd just have the still image here. But what I mean by a real native application is that when you have a React Native mobile application, when a user clicks on a button, it is genuinely a native button that's provided by Android or iOS, for example. It's not like some approaches where they essentially spin up a browser inside a mobile app, for example, and you're not necessarily clicking on the real buttons that came with your Android phone or with your iOS system. So a user wouldn't know unless you told them necessarily that they're working with a React Native application, which I think is really exciting, building a JavaScript app that actually becomes a real native mobile app. So these are the different kind of areas I'm going to talk about and the comparisons between the three different approaches, which is working with React applications, working with React Native applications, and then the iOS applications. So to begin with, onto language. So React Native, as I mentioned earlier, it's almost like working with React but creating native apps. They're very similar in the syntax they use, in the way you kind of wire up the applications, and the way you compose the applications. So I say it's almost identical. It isn't quite the same. You couldn't just take a React project and dump it into a React Native shell to make a mobile application, but it is very similar, and the learning curve is quite shallow. I found that actually some of the pre-made components that come with React Native are actually easier to work with than React. So for example, handling pop-ups or modals that pop out the screen. One of the solutions you can use in React for that is this a concept called a portal, which is part of the React API. And they're fairly easy to use, and they take away some of the pain of working with pop-up components and some of the challenges they work with. But the React Native solution is this component which you import into one of your components in your application called a modal, so called something similar. But it's so much easier to use and takes away so much more of the pain of kind of having pop-ups come throughout your screen. So I was really surprised that actually the React Native experience from this point of view is I actually preferred to React. Something to kind of mention is that it's just JavaScript under the surface, really, with a React Native application. So lots of the quirks that exist with JavaScript, like with the this keyword and lots of other things like that, are still present when you're developing and you're still working. So although there's no difference there between React and React Native, the frustrations I have with JavaScript at times are still present when working with React Native applications. So then looking at the language for a native iOS application. So you can use Objective-C, which is one of the kind of the older approach to developing native iOS apps, but the more modern approach is using this language called Swift. It came out, I believe, in 2014, developed by Apple. And it's a really nice, modern feeling language. I really liked using it for lots of different reasons. Primarily, these two concepts here in the middle of the screen. So the language has got type checking, but also type inference as well. So Swift, when it's compiled, will make sure that you're not using an integer where you're meant to be using a string. So it's got that kind of checking in there, which can catch bugs, which is fantastic. However, it's also got type inference, which means you don't have to declare your variables as being a string or as being an integer or as being a date or something like that. You get the benefits of the type checking at compile time, which is fantastic, but you don't have to kind of litter your code with lots of different declarations. It will kind of work it out automatically for you, which I think means you get the kind of safety, but also get the speed of developing as well. So some of the benefits of JavaScript, but with a kind of bit more safety. It was interesting learning the language. So I picked up the Apple kind of textbook that's available online. It was either free or quite cheap. And getting started with Swift was really easy. It kind of felt a bit like JavaScript, but it felt kind of a bit more structured and a bit safer to me. But then all of a sudden my learning curve kind of went up a bit of a step. So I found the kind of basics of the language really easy to learn, but then I didn't find it linear going to some of the more advanced features of the language. So in particular, I'd not worked with optional types before. I've since worked with them in TypeScript, but an optional type, if you haven't worked with it before, is basically there may be data there, there may be not, so you just have to kind of take care with it. And I found it a bit confusing to work with them in Swift, primarily because you have to, well, one way of working with them is unwrapping them if you want to access a value inside of it. And it's got this kind of exclamation mark syntax that confused me for a while and kind of struggled to get my head around. But there were a few other areas of the language that I thought, first few chapters of the book, really easy to learn, then all of a sudden it kind of stepped up a little bit, whereas other languages I've learned kind of have a nice linear learning curve. So just kind of a summary there, looking at the language. I preferred working with Swift compared to React Native and for React for the web, primarily because I preferred working with Swift compared to JavaScript, really. It wasn't really so much the React Native or the React components of that, it's the fact that it's just JavaScript under the surface and in your kind of methods and functionality in your React or React Native applications. And comparing React Native to React for the web, I actually preferred React Native because I thought some of the components that come with the library actually were a lot easier to work with. So overall, I think Swift has the best developer experience when it comes to the language. So tooling and infrastructure, two really kind of important parts of any project. So with a native iOS project, I develop on a Mac and I used Xcode, which came with my Mac, and the emulators for testing the application, seeing what it looked like, also come with Xcode as well, built in. The emulator experience was generally really good. It seemed to kind of match up whenever I looked at a real application on my phone, primarily really, I suppose, because they're developed by Apple to be used on Apple phones, so they probably spend a lot of money making the emulators really good and really realistic to an actual mobile application. So I know I've worked with other types of technology before where you use an emulator or a simulator and then you get it into the real world or whatever device you're going to use it on, and it's totally different. But I found the emulators to be really good, actually. So Swift for iOS applications is compiled. You have to compile it before it's run on any devices or before you upload to the App Store, for example. developing UIs often involves quite a lot of quick iterations, I find. I want to make a change to a layout or a color or add a quick bit of functionality, and having the whole app compiled each time before I could then look at the changes in the emulator, I actually found quite frustrating. Other compiled languages I've worked with before, I haven't been kind of going through as quicker iterations because I haven't been working with UIs. So I actually found this, quite frustrating to work with after a time, even though I wasn't working with a really, really big project when I was doing it. So moving on to React Native, I tend to use WebStorm for my IDE. That seems to split opinion massively. A lot of people go, ooh, or a lot of people go, oh yeah, we feel you. So I don't know whether to ask for opinion or not on that. So I use WebStorm for all of my JavaScript development, and I use that for my React Native development as well. But the emulators I use to test what the application would look like came from Xcode as well. They're exactly the same ones that I would use for developing native applications with Swift. So that was good because, again, the representations of my project were always pretty much accurate to what it looked like on a real device, which was really good. And you have some kind of confidence that you're building and testing against something that Apple made for an Apple product, which was really good. The big difference between working with React Native compared to Swift was the ability to have hot reloading. So if you've not worked with it before, you save your changes in WebStorm or your IDE of choice, and automatically your changes get shown in the browser if you're working with a web project, or in the emulator automatically, which was a massive time saver. I didn't think it would be as much of a difference, but for me it really, really impacted the developer experience for me. So overall, looking at tooling, working with React Native and comparing that to the native side, they had the same emulator experience, so there's no difference there, but they were both equally as good, which is a good thing. I much preferred having the hot reloading functionality that comes with the React Native tooling compared to the compilation. It made it a lot faster to develop. I preferred React Native to the native iOS development there overall. And the React Native experience was pretty much the same as React. React's also got hot reloading capabilities in lots of the common infrastructures you can use. So overall, I think React Native was the winner there for me, and it's the same as React. So moving on to styling the UI, obviously a really important part of the application. So with the native iOS approach, inside of Xcode, which you can use for lots of different projects, for building native iOS apps, you use the Xcode interface builder, which is basically a set of tools that come with Xcode for building interfaces. So I'll show you a picture of it in a minute if you've not used it before for a bit of context. It gives you a lot of kind of fine-grained control, and there's lots of sliders and menus and drop-downs and stuff like that for manually dragging and dropping stuff and making your UI look as you want it to. And I really liked that to begin with. It felt like I had a lot of control and a lot of power. But in the end, I found it actually quite cluttered, and I felt it was quite hard to I wanted to make a particular change to a particular part of one of the screens, and I have to maybe go 30 seconds to 2 minutes to find the right slider or the right button or the right checkbox that I wanted to find, that I needed to enact the change I wanted. So to begin with, fantastic, but over time I actually found it quite frustrating. So here's a screenshot of just a sample project. So lots of things going on the screen. To your left, you've got the files, you've got things that interact with the main view and the main storyboard here in the middle. And off to the right, you've got the code files that relate to what's going on over there. And on the very far right, you can see there's some different checkboxes and drop-downs for controlling what different aspects of the UI look like. And yeah, to begin with, I loved this. I thought it was absolutely fantastic, but over time I found it a bit frustrating, and I found it slowed down my development. Here's another example here. This was actually part of a blog post I wrote to try and describe how to make a UI element scrollable, because I didn't find it to be natively easy. And you can see there's just lots of things going on here. There's lots of checkboxes, lots of information. I found it a bit overwhelming and frustrating over time. And then, yeah, just a final kind of screenshot. This is all about specifying how you want a particular element to be positioned relative to the kind of view and container it's in. Very manual, lots of control. I tended not to like that towards the end of my kind of experience developing with this prototype app that I built. So moving on to React Native, it's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, really. So you style your applications using Flexbox and CSS, which are two really common web technologies. So I found that really easy to get my head around because I've used Flexbox and CSS in various web projects before, and they were quite familiar to me. And in fact, it's very similar to React. It's there's not really any techniques I've used in any React Native development that are different really than any React applications, which was quite nice coming from a React background to just kind of seamlessly transition into this. One of the nice things I found about Flexbox is that in the browser where it was designed to be used originally, it handles resizing elements quite gracefully, and it does that automatically if you expand and shrink the screen in the browser, or if you rotate a mobile application to be horizontal, it automatically positions all the elements quite nicely. You don't have to do too much work. Whereas with the native iOS approach, at least the way I was doing it and the way that I found, you almost had to specify a layout for portrait and a layout for landscape, and they were almost kind of two different tickets. Here's an example of a React Native project. So down the bottom of the screen here, I've just got a style sheet object, which just comes from React Native. It's very similar to a CSS style sheet, really. And it's all just controlled through code. I've just defined a bunch of constant things here, and I just apply them to different elements of the screen here. And it's all in the same file, which is part of the kind of React and React Native philosophy. And I found that a lot easier in the end to be able to associate what's going on in my view with how I want it to look. So just as a bit of a summary there, so React and React Native are really kind of similar. They use Flexbox and CSS, which was fantastic coming from a React background. And I actually much preferred working with the React Native approach of kind of programmatically styling things as opposed to the Xcode interface builder for having this kind of manual control. Has anyone got any questions on styling at all? Yeah, fantastic. Hi.
Is all of CSS supported?
Is all of CSS supported? I don't know. I only really found I had to use a small subset of CSS to achieve what I wanted. It was a far smaller subset of what I'd use in the browser to develop a React application. So I don't know the answer, but my instinct is that everything would be supported, to be honest with you. That's it. Thank you for your question. So now looking at UI and logic. So this is all about connecting up different aspects of your interface to the logic that you want to be triggered when people interact with your interface. So again, another important part of developing applications. So with the native iOS approach, it's got this MVC paradigm. So you've got a controller, you've got a model which houses your data, you've got a view which shows your data to the user, and a controller which kind of controls both of them. The view is the storyboard area in the middle of the section here. So this is what your view is, the different storyboard of your application. The controller are Swift source code files. So over here on the right of the screen, you can see it's just the kind of code. What I found a bit frustrating about this is that you have to make sure the appropriate files are open and close at the same time to connect different bits of your view to the logic in your application. So I'm not going to do it now because coding demonstrations never work, but essentially the way you make a connection between your source code to the view, say you want to control a button on a page, is you go over to your Swift source code file, you hold down on a Mac something like a shift key, I think, off the top of my head. You drag from the source control file and you drop it onto the element you want. So you make a kind of visible link with your cursor, and that's how you connect them together. And then what the Xcode interface builder will do is drop a reference into your source code. It will basically create a variable for you that's already linked up in the background. So I don't know how well you can see it. This isn't for the particular view that's visible, but there's these these outlet things which are basically references to the appropriate part of the view of your application. And I like this to begin with because it was quite cool to drag and drop things and have a reference already made for you. But again, you have to kind of make sure you've got the right folders open at the same time. Otherwise, you want to work on a bit of the view and you can't find the right source file to connect it with. And also, I ran into some problems that took me quite a while to solve where you might want to delete one of these outlets, and naturally I just went and kind of deleted the line of code thinking the variable's gone, everyone's forgot about it, we don't have to deal with that ever again. But Xcode did something clever in the background where the reference is more than just the kind of line of code in the source file there. So in the end I found out how to delete that link, but again I had to kind of go through a few sub-menus to find out what to do. So once you know it, it's fantastic, and it's easy to find, but it was more that I had to delete the line of code and then kind of go through 2 or 3 menus to find what I wanted to do. So that slowed me down a little bit. Again, another kind of polar opposite really, working with React Native. One of the core concepts of React and React Native is building your application using components, which is all about bundling up the logic and the markup in one kind of place, really. So because of that, the logic and the markup that controls your view is in one location, which I found really good. And your markup's created with JSX. If you haven't worked with it before, it's kind of like a hybrid between HTML and JavaScript. It's all kind of mixed up together. So here's an example here. Although I'm not hooking up any logic and any kind of functionality, the principle's still the same. So at the very top, with the big red box, I've got basically a property on an object, and I'm associating that with this bit of the view, with this bit of what I want to render to the user, really easily just by kind of, inserting the variable in, if you like. So there's no dragging and dropping. That's where the reference is, and if I wanted to delete where this variable was used inside this slide component, then I just delete it, and it kind of goes straight away. Any kind of eagle-eyed people here today might notice that this is a slide and this is a first slide. So this application I'm showing you today is actually written in React, which you may expect being a React geek. But yeah, so this is the presentation you're looking at under the surface. So in conclusion, I much preferred the React Native approach of doing this, having everything in one file, everything programmatic, found it a lot easier to use, although the native iOS approach is neat. And I found that React was basically the same as React for the web here, because when you're talking about connecting UI and logic, the fact that it's a mobile app or you're working with a web app is pretty much agnostic and doesn't matter. Project roadmap. This is really meant to mean what are the decisions you have to make as a developer from starting out to getting your app into production and deploying it, and what are the kind of options you have along the way for doing that. So with React Native, I found that there were kind of two main branches you could take and two approaches. One is using a tool called Expo, which is kind of like a shell around your React Native application, and Expo basically makes it feel like more of a hybrid. You don't have any access to any of the native iOS code or any Android code. You're just kind of writing JavaScript, and it's got some neat tools where you can share your project very easily between developers that also have the right Expo tools. So you can very quickly create a URL of your development project, send it to someone, and they can open it up in the kind of Xcode tools and see what your app's looking like, which is really neat. And they can also do similar kind of things with QR codes as well. The other approach is using the React Native CLI route, which is kind of more, I suppose, traditional route that was created by Facebook originally. And this is where you have access to the native code for iOS and Android, as well as the JavaScript code as well. So it's not always clear, or it wasn't at least clear to me, which one to pick. They both seem to have their benefits and their pros and their cons. But one challenge I found quite a way into one of my kind of first projects is going down the Expo route. Although I didn't have access to any of the native files, so I couldn't see any of the iOS or Android files to change anything, I found that I needed that for something I didn't think I'd need it for. So I wanted to integrate Google Firebase for authentication, and I found that I had to add a few lines to a couple of Android files and a couple of iOS files. And wasn't really much code, it was just adding a few things into the appropriate configs, basically. But I found there wasn't really a way of doing that with Expo at all. You have to essentially eject it. So the project kind of looks like being a React Native CLI project. So it's almost as if you went down the first route in the first place and you lose those benefits of Expo. And it was probably because it was one of my first times developing, but that was quite a way through the project that I found that, and it wasn't quite clear what the best approach was. Although you could argue there's flexibility there. So it swings and roundabouts, there's pros and cons. And because of the kind of style of React Native being a kind of open source JavaScript project, there's lots of community approaches. So I looked at what other companies were doing, what other people were doing in their side projects, and when I started, it wasn't quite clear what the kind of best approach was to structure an application and what the kind of impacts would be of going down a particular route. So with the native iOS approach, quite the opposite really. There's a kind of clear linear learning path between this is how you go from writing hello world all the way kind of through to releasing an app to production, and that kind of makes sense really with the Apple philosophy of doing things the Apple way, so I wasn't really surprised with that. So comparing both of them together, I actually preferred the kind of guided nature that the Apple and native iOS approach gives you. It feels a lot more handheld and could be argued it's less flexible, but I found it was a lot easier to get going, and the mark of a kind of good roadmap, I think. It delayed the point at which I had to make important architectural decisions, which was really useful. it was quite late in the project that I had to start kind of making important kind of branching changes, which was really handy. Deploying, kind of getting towards the end of the project lifecycle here. So with React Native, if you've built your project using the React Native CLI option, which was one of the two options, inside alongside all your kind of JavaScript code and the config options, there's an Xcode project in there. If you open the Xcode project into Xcode, from that point onwards, you just use the Xcode tools as if it was a native iOS application. So it was really seamless, really. It was almost as if I was just developing a native iOS app, which was good. Now, with the Expo route of working with a React Native application, I found that being able to deploy it, I couldn't quite get it to work with Xcode for some reason, but that was probably something I was doing. But there was a similar Apple desktop tool that I found where you could bundle up the application. And again, from that point onward, it was just as if it was a native iOS application, which was really handy because there's all the Apple documentation available and it felt very streamlined. Something that is really neat and worth mentioning about Expo, it's not really deploying, it's more about what they call publishing, which is sharing, I suppose, a kind of snapshot of the application, really. So if I develop using the Expo CLI route and I've got this Expo shell around my React Native application, I can share demos with people in my team really easily. It's really, really handy. But I can then also ship over-the-air updates with them, so I can very easily kind of push my code out to them and they don't have to go through the App Store or something like that to get test versions of my application, which is really handy and means you can iterate a lot faster. I didn't really explore that too much in depth. I was working on this kind of research project by myself, but I'd be interested to hear afterwards if anyone's got any experiences or any comments about that. It'd be great to hear. So overall, the React Native approach was pretty much the same as the native iOS approach, which was really good, and Apple spent a lot of time and money making that process relatively smooth once you kind of get your head around the documentation. So they were both really quite painless approaches to do, which was really good. And I've heard that kind of this is more on the publishing side, that the Expo route is actually better than the native iOS route because you can share these over-the-air updates with other developers on your team and other test users, for example, which makes things a bit faster. But again, I'd be really keen to hear anyone else's thoughts on that. Finally, nearing the end, looking at bugs and support. None of us write bugs in our code, right? No, unfortunately, these things happen, and my philosophy going into this before I even looked at explored how different things worked with React Native or Swift was, my philosophy is, imagine it's 5 p.m, I want to go home, it's on a Friday, which project would I rather be working with? And that kind of helps you make an informed opinion about these things. So looking at React Native, at least when I started building React Native apps, which was quite a while ago, and when I looked at this research project, we're kind of looking just after 6 months ago maybe, it felt like it had lots of moving parts. There was lots of different tools around the infrastructure for doing various different things, for building, testing, running up, and these kind of things. And I found that when I had a bug, it was quite hard to tell whether it was in my code or my config or in one of the React Native tools as part of their ecosystem. And I found that when I looked on the kind of classic GitHub issues, there was lots of breaking changes between 0.57 and 0.58 and 0.61 and 0.62. So it was quite hard to kind of root out where the real bug was, which was quite frustrating to get started. With React, I suppose it's similar in some respects because it's an open source project and there's lots of tools and there's lots of open source infrastructure you can use, but it's got such a bigger community and it's so much more mature that I've never really had many problems with this. Whenever I have a bug with React, it seems to be that I can find and identify where the problem is quite quickly, which is really handy. Kind of in the polar opposite really, with the native route, it was actually really easy to find a solution to whatever problem I was having, whether it was a problem with my code or my config, or whether the way I set up Xcode, for example. And not only was it easy to find a solution, but it was always quite clear on Stack Overflow or one of the Apple help sites or on GitHub what was the kind of best practice and recommended solution that was advised either by Apple or by well-known people in the community. So I often had a lot of confidence when I was making a change or fixing a bug that I was doing the right thing, which is quite good. So overall, I much preferred the native experience with this compared to working with React for the web. And React for the web I actually preferred with React Native because it's a lot more mature really. So arguably it's a slightly unfair comparison, but this is all about the experience of what it's like to develop from my perspective. So that's what I found. So overall, as a bit of a summary, we looked at the language. Swift, very modern, very nice feeling language, type checking and type inference, so you get the speed of development, but the power of type checking. So I actually preferred this to working with React Native and React and fundamentally JavaScript. The tooling and infrastructure, I actually prefer working with React Native fundamentally because of this ability to have hot reloading. I, at the time, wasn't aware of a way you could have hot reloading available in the native iOS projects I was working in, and the React Native version of this hot reloading worked really well for me and worked really easily. With the styling, I preferred the kind of programmatic approach using Flexbox and CSS and having variables inside source code rather than having the Xcode interface builder to control different aspects of my UI. Connecting the UI to logic, so how do you make a button on your page responsive? Similar to the point above, I preferred having the programmatic approach of having variables and functions and passing those things into my React components using code, as opposed to creating these links between the different bits of your application in the storyboard and in the source control file, the source code file. With the project roadmap approach, I much preferred the kind of handheld Apple guided approach. It was a lot easier to get things going, it was a lot smoother, and again, fundamentally, I didn't have to make important architectural branching decisions until quite late in the process. With deploying, they were quite similar approaches really to kind of getting your code up into the App Store. But the reason why I've chosen React Native here is because of publishing, which is I suppose a kind of subset of deploying really. This ability to have over-the-air updates and share your code easily, which I think in principle sounds fantastic, although I've not got too much experience with. And then finally for support, it was a lot easier to find exactly where the problem was when I was working with the native approach using Swift. And it was a lot easier to see whether a solution was kind of best practice and recommended, or whether it was just kind of one of the many that are out there. So I got some resources. I got an article which was the inspiration for this presentation that I wrote on Medium, which you're more than welcome to check out. I'm sure we'll share these links and these slides afterwards. That's got a bit more detailed write-up and goes into a bit more elaborates a bit more on what I've spoken about today if you're interested. You can find these slides on my GitHub page, so I've got them hosted online using GitHub Pages. You can see all of the whole of the presentation online. And finally, this presentation was created with a tool called Spectacle, which is using React. So the Pac-Man down the bottom to all the buttons and everything that goes on, it was all part of the framework that comes with using Spectacle, which is just basically using React. Really easy to use, really easy development experience. I'd recommend anyone that's interested in React going and checking it out. It was basically painless to set up this application. So thank you very much for your time, giving up your evening to have me come and talk to you. I really do appreciate it. If anyone's got any questions or comments, the floor's open and have we got time?
Yeah, a few minutes.
Fantastic, yeah. If anyone's got any questions, I welcome them.
Thank you.
Let's go. Round of beer. That's a fantastic question. Did I get the chance to test performance? I didn't really, to be honest with you. That wasn't part of the project. It was more about what would it feel like to develop with these two and what would it be like if we had to maintain one long term. Unfortunately, the project didn't go ahead. So I got a couple of prototypes and a couple of Hello World ++ apps, I suppose, out there. But no, I didn't get the chance to experiment with that. Have you had the chance to do that? I don't know. I imagine so. There's lots of tooling that enables React Native. So when you're debugging a React Native application, you can open up the developer tools in Google Chrome, for example, which is basically where you can console log stuff. So I imagine whatever tools you have in Chrome, for example, you may be able to exploit for a React Native application, but I don't know, to be honest with you. That's a really interesting area to have a look at. So yeah, sorry I can't answer your question more. Thank you for your time. Cheers.